The overhead speakers buzzed with an announcement, sharp and robotic, slicing through the clamor of passengers swarming the departure terminal. The air carried the scent of stale coffee and overpriced pretzels, mingling with the faint tang of jet fuel from the runways beyond the massive glass windows. Travelers moved in waves, their faces reflecting everything from excitement to exhaustion. Amid the chaos, one figure stood apart, a picture of calm on the surface but a storm brewing beneath. Eli Davis adjusted the strap of his weathered leather duffel bag, his eyes scanning the glowing departure board overhead. Gate 12. He still had an hour, yet his pulse quickened. He hated flying, not the act itself, but everything leading up to it. Security lines, rushed strangers, and, more often than not, the subtle weight of 100 assumptions pressing down on him before he even handed over his boarding pass. "Excuse me, sir." A middle-aged man in a suit brushed past Eli, not even glancing back as he jostled his arm. Eli exhaled slowly, forcing himself to shake it off. His grandmother used to say, "Keep your head high, Eli. Dignity's not for sale, no matter how cheap. They try to make you feel." She'd raised him with that wisdom after his mother passed away when he was 9, and those words had carried him through many hard days. Today was supposed to be a good day, a trip to visit his sister Mia, who had just landed her dream job in Denver. She'd begged him to come celebrate, and Eli couldn't refuse her. They'd always been close, and her joy was a light he needed in his own life right now. But even as he thought about Mia's infectious laugh, the unease in his chest grew heavier. It always did in places like this. Airports were strange battlegrounds, places where judgment and suspicion often clung to him like a shadow he couldn't shake. Eli approached the security checkpoint, his step steady despite the rising tide of unease. The line moved slower than molasses, winding through the maze of stanchions like a river that didn't know where it was going. He pulled out his ID and boarding pass, gripping them tightly as though they were shields. The security officer at the podium barely glanced at his documents before waving him toward the metal detectors. Eli took a deep breath, stepped forward, and placed his bag on the conveyor belt. His shoes followed, along with his belt and the slim silver watch Mia had gifted him last Christmas. "Step through," another officer instructed, his tone clipped. Eli moved forward, his arms raised as the scanner hummed. It beeped once. "Step aside, sir," the officer said. Eli frowned but complied, stepping into a secondary screening area where another officer, a tall man with a rigid posture and a badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, waited. "Spread your arms," the man ordered, his voice carrying the faintest edge of impatience. Eli obeyed, feeling the cold wand pass over his body. He caught the officer's eyes as he worked. They were flat, impersonal, but behind them was something else, something Eli had seen countless times before. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "Step back," the officer barked. After finishing, Eli hesitated. "Is there a problem?" "Step back," the man repeated, his tone sharper now. Eli bit the inside of his cheek, but complied again. His heart was thudding louder now, but he forced himself to stay calm. He'd been taught early on that anger wouldn't serve him in moments like this. The officer turned to a colleague and muttered something under his breath. The other officer, a younger woman with a tightly pinned bun, glanced at Eli, her expression unreadable. She nodded, and the tall man walked over to Eli's bag, now sitting alone on the conveyor belt. "What's in here?" he asked, holding it up. Eli frowned. "Just clothes and toiletries. It's a carry-on." The man's lips twitched, almost like a smirk, but he said nothing. Instead, he unzipped the bag and began rifling through its contents with deliberate slowness. Every folded shirt, every neatly packed item was pulled out and inspected as though Eli had something to hide. Around him, passengers moved through the checkpoint with little more than a glance. A young white couple with backpacks breezed through without a second look. A businessman with noise-cancelling headphones passed by so quickly he barely stopped walking, but Eli stood there, rooted in place, as his belongings were scrutinized in plain view. He could feel the stares, quick, fleeting glances from people who didn't want to linger but couldn't help themselves. "What's going on?" Eli asked, his voice firmer now. The officer didn't look up. "Routine check." Eli's jaw tightened. "This doesn't feel routine." The man's hands froze for a moment before he looked up, meeting Eli's eyes for the first time. "Is there a problem, sir?" Eli opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind. "Pick your battles, Eli. Not all fights are worth the cost." He shook his head. "No problem." The officer nodded once, then continued his methodical search. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Eli's flight time ticked closer, the digital clock above the checkpoint, a constant reminder that his window was shrinking. Finally, the officer zipped up the bag and handed it back. "You can go." Eli snatched the bag and hurried to put on his shoes and belt, his hands trembling with frustration. He glanced at the clock again, 20 minutes until boarding. If he ran, he could make it, but just as he stepped toward the terminal, a voice called out behind him. "Sir, we need you to come with us for additional questioning." Eli froze, his stomach dropping like a stone. He turned to see the tall officer, flanked by two others, their expressions unreadable, but their postures unmistakably authoritative. "I don't have time for this," Eli said, his voice taut. "My flight leaves in 20 minutes. "That's not our concern," the officer said flatly. "Please follow us." Eli's breath caught in his chest. The eyes of every passerby seemed to be on him now, their whispers buzzing in his ears like static. He glanced back at the clock, then at the officers, and he knew this wasn't going to end quickly. His heart pounded as he took a reluctant step forward, following the officers toward an unmarked door at the edge of the terminal. The world around him blurred, the hum of the airport fading into a deafening silence. Somewhere deep inside, anger burned like a low flame, but he swallowed it down. For now? The door clicked shut behind him. The room Eli was led into was stark and clinical, lit by a single fluorescent light that buzzed faintly overhead. The air was cool, almost unnaturally so, as if designed to sap the warmth from anyone who entered. A plain metal table stood in the center, flanked by two chairs. On the far wall, a security camera blinked red, its lens fixed squarely on the table like an unblinking eye. "Sit!" one of the officers ordered, gesturing to a chair. Eli hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to walk away, to push back against whatever this was, but he knew how that would go. He'd learned long ago that confrontation wasn't an option for someone like him. Not here. Not now. He lowered himself into the chair, the cold metal seeping through the fabric of his jeans. "Wait here," the officer said, before stepping out of the room with his colleagues, leaving Eli alone with his thoughts. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the light. Eli stared at the table, his fingers gripping the strap of his bag so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Why does this always happen? He thought back to his childhood in a small Georgia town, where he'd first learned what it meant to be seen as other. He was 7 when his teacher had pulled him aside after class and accused him of cheating on a math test. She'd refused to believe he could solve the problems on his own. "It's okay, Eli," his mother had told him that evening, brushing his curls from his forehead as he sat on the porch steps, tears streaming down his face. "Some people see the color of your skin before they see anything else. That doesn't mean you're any less capable. You just have to work harder to prove them wrong." That advice had stayed with him, shaping his every decision. It had pushed him to excel in school, graduate with honors, and land a steady job as a project manager. But no matter how hard he worked, moments like this, moments where he was reduced to nothing more than a target of suspicion, still found him. The door opened suddenly, pulling Eli from his thoughts. The tall officer returned, this time accompanied by another man in plain clothes, whose sharp, calculating eyes immediately zeroed in on Eli. "This is Agent Foster," the officer said, taking a position near the door. "He'll be asking you a few questions." Foster pulled out a chair and sat across from Eli, placing a file folder on the table between them. He opened it with deliberate slowness, flipping through a few pages before looking up. "Mr. Davis, is it?" he asked, his tone neutral but edged, with something Eli couldn't quite place. "Yes," Eli replied, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his chest. "Where are you traveling today?" Foster asked. "Denver," Eli said. "And the purpose of your trip?" "To visit my sister." Foster nodded, scribbling something in the file. "How long will you be staying?" "Just the weekend." Another note. Another pause. "Have you ever been to Denver before?" Eli frowned. "No. Why does that matter?" Foster ignored the question, his pen tapping lightly against the edge of the table. "Do you have any checked luggage?" "No, just this," Eli said, gesturing to his duffel bag. "And you packed it yourself?" "Yes." Foster leaned back in his chair, studying Eli as if trying to decipher a puzzle. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. "Look," Eli said finally, unable to hold back any longer. "Can you tell me what this is?" "About? I haven't done anything wrong." Foster's expression didn't change. "We're just following protocol." Eli let out a bitter laugh. "Protocol, huh? Funny how protocol always seems to take longer for people like me." The officer by the door shifted, but Foster raised a hand to silence him. His gaze never left Eli's. "Mr. Davis," Foster said calmly, "we have reason to believe you may be in possession of prohibited items." Eli's stomach dropped. "What? That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Foster asked, his tone still maddeningly neutral. "Because the security scan flagged your bag for further inspection. That bag has nothing in it but clothes and toiletries," Eli said, his voice rising. "You already searched it. Twice." "We're just being thorough," Foster said, closing the file. "For your safety and everyone else's." Eli's fists clenched under the table. He could feel the weight of their stares, their assumptions, their unspoken accusations. It wasn't the first time he'd been treated like this, but it didn't hurt any less. The minutes dragged on as Foster continued his line of questioning, each one more invasive than the last. Where did Eli work? Who had booked his flight? Did he know anyone in law enforcement? The questions weren't just about the trip, they were about him, his life, his choices, his very existence, and with every answer Eli gave, he felt the same frustration simmering just beneath the surface. The frustration of knowing that nothing, he said, would ever be enough. Finally, Foster stood and closed the file. "That'll be all for now, you can go." Eli stared at him, disbelief etched across his face. "That's it? After all that, I can just go?" Foster offered a thin smile. "Thank you for your cooperation." Eli rose from the chair, slinging his bag over his shoulder. He didn't say another word as he walked past the officer and out. The door, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and relief. Back in the terminal, the world seemed to rush around him at double speed. He checked the clock. His flight had already boarded. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath, striding toward the customer service desk. The agent behind the counter looked up with a polite smile that faltered when she saw the frustration in Eli's expression. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I missed my flight because of a so-called security check," Eli said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I need to rebook." The agent's fingers flew across her keyboard, her expression neutral but distant. "There's another flight to Denver in 3 hours," she said. "I can put you on standby." "Standby?" Eli repeated, his patience wearing thin. "It's the best I can do," the agent said, her tone brisk. Eli exhaled sharply, biting back the urge to argue. "Fine." As he stepped away from the counter, he caught sight of the tall officer from earlier, standing near a group of security personnel. Their laughter carried over the din of the terminal, and Eli's chest tightened as he noticed the officer glance his way. For a moment, their eyes met, and Eli saw it again. That smirk, faint but unmistakable. Eli's fists clenched at his sides. He turned and walked away, his mind racing with questions and the beginnings of an idea. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Somewhere deep inside, a fire had been lit, and this time Eli wasn't going to let it burn out quietly. Eli dropped into one of the rigid terminal chairs near Gate 26, his duffel bag slumping to the floor beside him. He ran a hand over his face, trying to will away the frustration tightening his chest. The 3-hour wait ahead felt like a cruel reminder of how easily his day had been derailed. He tried to focus on the good, the reason for this trip. Mia had been over the moon when she called to share the news about her promotion. "Eli, they picked me, out of everyone," she'd said, her voice trembling with disbelief and excitement. Eli had been so proud of her, of how she'd worked her, way up in an industry where so few people looked like her. She deserved this celebration, and he wasn't going to let anything keep him from being there. Still, the thought of that smirking officer made his blood boil. Eli clenched his fists, the memory of the man's cold, dismissive gaze replaying. In his mind, like a loop he couldn't shut off. It wasn't just about missing the flight. It was the humiliation, the way they'd reduced him to a suspect. As passengers filed past him, Eli felt a sudden weight on his chest, a familiar heaviness he hadn't felt in years. It was the same feeling he'd had after his high school basketball coach benched him for 3 games straight without explanation. The same weight that had pressed down on him during his first job interview, where the hiring manager's smile had faltered the moment Eli walked in. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small notebook, its corners worn soft from years of use. Flipping it open, he found the page he was looking for, a list of affirmations written in his grandmother's looping handwriting. "You are worthy. You are strong. You are enough." Eli stared at the words, hearing her voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside him. "Don't let them break you," she used to say. "You've got a light in you, Eli. They see it, even if they pretend they don't. That's why they try to dim it. Don't let them." He exhaled slowly, closing the notebook and slipping it back into his bag. He wouldn't let this beat him. Not today. As the hours dragged on, Eli noticed a growing commotion near one of the other gates. A group of uniformed security officers gathered in a tight cluster, their hushed tones and quick glances making it clear something was going on. Among them was the tall officer from earlier. Eli tensed as he saw the man laugh at something another officer said before gesturing toward the security checkpoint. Eli couldn't hear the words, but he could feel their weight. A quiet, mocking dismissal. The sight stirred something in him, a mixture of anger and determination. He wasn't sure what he was going to do yet, but he knew he couldn't let this go unanswered. Eli rose from his seat and made his way toward the coffee kiosk nearby, keeping the group of officers in his peripheral vision. As he waited for his order, he noticed another man standing a few feet away, watching the same group. The man was dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his posture relaxed but alert. Something about him seemed out of place, not a traveler but not security either. Eli's curiosity peaked as the man's gaze flickered to him briefly before returning to the officers. "Excuse me," Eli said, stepping closer. "You work here?" The man turned to him, his expression neutral but not unfriendly. "Not exactly," he said. "Why do you ask?" Eli hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Just curious. You seem observant." The man raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I suppose you could say that." Before Eli could press further, his coffee order was called, and the man gave him a small nod before walking away. Eli watched him go, his mind buzzing with questions. Back at his gate, Eli sipped his coffee and tried to focus on a podcast playing through his headphones. But the tension in his body refused to ease. His thoughts kept circling back to the officer, to the way he'd smirked, as if Eli's frustration had been a personal victory. "Excuse me?" a voice interrupted. Eli looked up to see an older woman standing in front of him, her kind eyes framed by silver-rimmed glasses. "I couldn't help but notice earlier," she said, lowering her voice. "The way they treated you. That wasn't right." Eli blinked, caught off guard by her words. Thank you," he said cautiously. "I just wanted to say—" "I see it too," she continued, her voice tinged with sadness. "The way some people are treated differently for no reason at all. It's not fair." Eli felt a lump rise in his throat. He wasn't used to strangers acknowledging the injustice so openly, and it caught him off guard. "Thank you," he said again, his voice softer this time. The woman nodded, placing a gentle hand on his arm before walking away. Eli sat back, her words lingering in his mind. It was a small gesture, but it reminded him that not everyone was blind to the truth. As his standby flight approached boarding, Eli noticed the tall officer again, now standing near the TSA checkpoint with a group of supervisors. The sight sent a fresh wave of frustration coursing through him, but then he noticed something else. The man from the coffee kiosk was back, standing near the same group of officers. This time Eli could see him more clearly, and what he saw made his heart skip a beat. The man was holding a badge. Eli couldn't hear what was being said, but the shift in the officer's body language was impossible to miss. The tall officer's smirk had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that bordered on nervousness. Eli's curiosity burned. Who was this man? And why did it seem like the tables were suddenly turning? He didn't have time to dwell on it. The gate agent called for standby passengers, and Eli stepped forward, his boarding pass in hand. As he handed it over, he cast one last glance at the group near security. The tall officer was speaking now, his gestures defensive as the man in the suit listened intently. Eli boarded the plane, his mind racing with questions. He didn't know what had just happened back there, but something told him this wasn't the end. As the plane taxied down the runway, Eli stared out the window, the events of the day replaying in his mind. He thought about the officer's smirk, the older woman's kind words, and the mysterious man who seemed to hold more power than he let on. Eli didn't know where this was going, but one thing was clear: change was in the air, and for the first time in hours, he felt a glimmer of hope. Unbeknownst to Eli, back in the terminal, the man in the suit was finishing his conversation with the tall officer. "I'll need to review the security footage," the man said, his tone calm but firm. "And I'll need a detailed account of why Mr. Davis was detained." The tall officer shifted uncomfortably. "It was just routine protocol," he said. The man raised an eyebrow. "That's not what it looks like." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but the man held up a hand to stop him. "This isn't over," the man said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that left no room for argument. As the officer watched him walk away, a bead of sweat trickled down his temple. For the first time that day, he felt the same unease he'd inflicted on others. Eli adjusted his seatbelt as the plane climbed steadily into the sky, his hands gripping the armrests. Outside, the sprawling city shrank to a patchwork of lights, disappearing behind a curtain of clouds. But his mind was still tethered to the events at the airport. The image of the tall officer's smug expression and the quiet authority of the man in the suit stayed with him like unresolved chords in a song. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play, something that extended beyond his missed flight and bruised pride. The lingering tension in his chest told him this wasn't over. 2 hours into the flight, Eli leaned back in his seat, trying to let the gentle hum of the engines soothe his nerves. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, Memories surfaced unbidden, like ghosts of the past. He was 12 again, standing in his middle school hallway, staring at his locker. The words, scrawled across the metal door in red marker, were seared into his memory. Go back where you came from. He'd felt the sting of humiliation, the raw ache of being singled out for something he couldn't change. His mother had found him, crying in his room that night. She hadn't said much, just pulled him into a hug and whispered, "Eli, you can't let their ignorance define you. You're better than that. Always remember who you are." Her words had stayed with him, even when she was no longer there to say them. A sudden jolt of turbulence snapped him back to the present. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The plane shook again, and a nervous murmur rippled through the cabin. Eli gripped the armrests, his pulse quickening. He wasn't usually afraid of flying, but after the day he'd had, his nerves were already frayed. The turbulence eased after a few minutes, but the unease in the pit of his stomach lingered. When the plane landed, Eli was one of the last to disembark, letting the other passengers rush past him. As he stepped into the terminal, he checked his phone for messages from Mia. "Can't wait to see you," her latest text read, accompanied by a string of excited emojis. Eli smiled despite himself. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and he needed that, now more than ever. But as he made his way through the bustling terminal, he noticed a familiar figure near the baggage claim. The man in the suit was standing by a row of vending machines, speaking quietly into his phone. Eli's stomach tightened. What was he doing here? Had he followed him? He hesitated, torn between confronting the man and walking away. Before he could decide, the man ended his call and turned, locking eyes with Eli. "Mr. Davis," he said, approaching with a measured stride. "We need to talk." Eli's throat tightened. "Who are you?" "My name is Marcus," the man said, his tone calm but firm. "I'm with the Department of Transportation's Office of Civil Rights." Eli blinked, taken aback. What?" Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge, holding it up for Eli to see. "We monitor complaints of discrimination and misconduct in airports," he explained, "and after what I witnessed earlier, I think you might have grounds for a formal report." Eli's heart raced. He'd never expected anyone to take notice, let alone offer help, but he wasn't sure if he trusted this man yet. "I don't know," Eli said cautiously. "What good would that do? It's not like anything will change." Marcus's expression softened. "I understand your hesitation," he said, "but I can assure you we take these matters seriously. If you're willing to share your side of the story, it could make a difference, not just for you, but for others who've been treated unfairly." Eli studied him, searching for any sign of insincerity, but Marcus's gaze was steady, his demeanor earnest. After a long moment, Eli nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's talk." They found a quiet corner in the terminal, away from the crowds. Marcus pulled out a tablet and began taking notes as Eli recounted everything that had happened, from the unjust detainment to the officer's dismissive attitude and the missed flight. As he spoke, the weight on his chest began to lift, replaced by a sense of validation he hadn't realized he needed. Someone was listening, someone believed him. Marcus asked thoughtful questions, never interrupting, and when Eli finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you for sharing that," Marcus said. "I know it wasn't easy." Eli shrugged, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "What happens now?" "Well," Marcus said, "I'll file an official report and review the security footage. If there's evidence to support your claims, and based on what I saw, I believe there will be, then we'll take appropriate action." Eli nodded, though doubt still lingered at the edges of his mind. "You really think anything will come of this?" Marcus met his gaze. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." As Eli left the terminal, a sliver of hope took root in his heart. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him moving forward. But that hope was short-lived. The next morning, as he scrolled through the news on his phone, his stomach dropped. A headline caught his eye: "Airport security under fire for allegations of racial profiling." He clicked on the article, his pulse quickening as he skimmed the text. The story detailed a series of complaints against the same airport he'd flown out of, with several passengers coming forward to share their experiences. One of the incidents described sounded eerily similar to his own encounter with the tall officer. Eli's chest tightened. This wasn't just about him. This was a pattern, a systemic problem that went far beyond a single bad experience. His phone buzzed with an incoming call, and he saw Marcus's name on the screen. "Eli," Marcus said when he answered, his voice tense. "We need to talk. There's more to this than we initially thought." Eli's heart pounded. As Marcus explained, as Marcus spoke, the pieces began to fall into place. The tall officer wasn't just a rogue agent acting on his own prejudices. He was part of a larger network within the airport security system, one that had been targeting minority passengers under the guise of enhanced screening. The revelations hit Eli like a punch to the gut. He thought about all the passengers who'd been humiliated, delayed, or worse, simply because of the color of their skin. And then Marcus said something that made Eli's blood run cold. "They know you've spoken to me," Marcus said, "and they're not happy about it." Eli's grip tightened on his phone. "What does that mean?" "It means they might try to discredit you," Marcus said. "We need to be prepared for anything." Eli spent the rest of the day in a haze of anxiety and anger. Every glance over his shoulder felt like a potential threat. Every unexpected noise made his heart race. But beneath the fear, a fire was building. He wasn't going to let them silence him. Not now. As he sat in his hotel room that evening, he opened his notebook and flipped to a blank page. He began writing, pouring out his thoughts, his anger, his determination. "They can try to intimidate me," he wrote, "but they won't stop me. I've come too far to back down now." He didn't know what the next day would bring, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going down without a fight. Eli woke the next morning with a knot in his stomach. Marcus's warning echoed in his mind. We need to be prepared for anything. Yet, as the sunlight filtered through the hotel, Gerton's determination overshadowed his fear. At 10 a.m., today he would face the storm in a nondescript office near the airport. The room buzzed with tension as Marcus laid out documents, security footage, and complaint records on the table. Another man joined them, an investigator from the Department of Transportation. His somber expression suggested the gravity of what they were uncovering. "We've found something," Marcus began, his tone heavy. He tapped a folder marked "Confidential." "The officer who detained you, Ian Brady, has been flagged in multiple internal complaints. These aren't isolated incidents. He's part of a coordinated effort targeting minority travelers." Eli's jaw tightened. "How coordinated?" Marcus exchanged a look with the investigator before answering. "There's an unofficial system within the TSA here, selective enforcement disguised as protocol. Brady's been manipulating the system to harass and delay passengers he perceives as undesirable, but it doesn't stop there." Marcus paused. "It's tied to a larger scheme involving illicit kickbacks." Eli blinked, stunned. "Kickbacks? What does that mean?" The investigator spoke up. "Brady and a few others have been deliberately delaying passengers who were likely to miss connecting flights, knowing they'd rebook through affiliated airlines or services. They've been receiving payments for pushing business in certain directions." Eli's stomach churned. "You're telling me this isn't just about racism? It's about profit?" Marcus nodded grimly. "Both. And it's been going on for years." The team reviewed the security footage from the day Eli was detained. The screen showed Brady intercepting Eli, his face impassive, but his actions deliberate. The footage zoomed in on Brady's subtle gestures, a quick glance toward a colleague, a whispered word. Later, frames captured Brady smirking as Eli was, led into secondary screening, but it was what came after that made Eli's blood boil. The footage showed Brady returning to his post, laughing with a colleague as he gestured toward Eli's gate. "Make sure he doesn't make it," Brady mouthed. Though there was no audio, Eli clenched his fists. He didn't even try to hide it. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on Eli's shoulder. "This footage is damning. Combined with the testimonies we've gathered, it's enough to take this to the highest levels." The press conference was scheduled for that afternoon. Marcus had insisted on making the findings public, ensuring transparency. Eli wasn't sure how he felt about being thrust into the spotlight, but he knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about exposing the system that had allowed people like Brady to thrive. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras trained on the small stage. Marcus stood at the podium, his voice steady as he outlined the investigation's findings. Eli sat off to the side, watching as the truth unfolded before a captivated audience. "And now," Marcus said, gesturing toward Eli, "I'd like to introduce Eli Davis, whose courage in coming forward helped make this investigation possible." Eli's heart raced as he stepped up to the microphone. He felt the weight of every eye in the room, but he also felt the weight of his mother's words, "Always remember who you are." Taking a deep breath, he spoke. "When I was detained at the airport, I thought it was just another bad day. Another instance of someone seeing my skin color and deciding it made me a threat. But as we've uncovered, it was part of something much bigger. This isn't just about me. It's about accountability, justice, and making sure no one else has to go through what I did." The room erupted into applause, but the moment was short-lived. A commotion near the back drew everyone's attention. Ian Brady himself had entered, flanked by two lawyers. His face was a mask of defiance. "I have nothing to hide," Brady shouted, his voice cutting through the room. "This is a witch hunt." Marcus stepped forward, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with Brady's outburst. "Mr. Brady," he said evenly, "the evidence speaks for itself. You're welcome to defend yourself in court." Brady's face darkened. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? This isn't over." Eli felt a chill run down his spine as Brady's gaze locked onto him. There was something menacing in his eyes, a silent promise of retribution. But before Brady could say more, two uniformed officers approached him. "Ian Brady," one of them said, "you're under arrest for misconduct, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Gasps rippled through the room as the officers cuffed Brady and began to lead him away. His bravado faltered, replaced by a flash of panic. "This isn't fair," he shouted. "I was just doing my job." Eli watched as Brady disappeared through the doors, a surreal mix of emotions swirling within him. Relief, anger, and something else. Closure. The days that followed were a whirlwind. News outlets picked up the story, and Eli found himself at the center of a national conversation about systemic racism and corruption. Messages poured in from strangers thanking him for speaking out, sharing their own experiences and calling for change. But one moment stood out above the rest. A handwritten letter arrived at Eli's hotel, addressed to him personally. Inside was a simple note: "Thank you for standing up. Because of you, my son won't have to feel like he doesn't belong. A grateful mother." Eli read the note twice, tears welling in his eyes. He thought about his own mother, about the strength she had instilled in him, and about the countless others who had endured what he had. This wasn't just his victory, it was theirs. On the final day of his trip, Eli returned to the airport. The atmosphere felt different now, lighter, freer. As he approached the security checkpoint, he noticed a new officer stationed at the post where Brady had once stood. She greeted him with a genuine smile. "Safe travels, sir," she said as she handed back his ID. Eli smiled back. "Thank you." As he walked toward his gate, a sense of peace washed over him. He knew the fight wasn't over. There were still battles to be won, still systems to dismantle. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope, and as the plane lifted into the sky, carrying him toward a brighter horizon, Eli knew he was ready for whatever came next. Eli's return home was greeted with a quiet sense of triumph, but it was clear the ripples of his experience were still expanding. His name had become synonymous with standing up against injustice, and while the attention was overwhelming at times, it also opened doors to meaningful change. Institutional reforms. 2 months after Ian Brady's arrest, a sweeping investigation into the airport's TSA division revealed a deeply ingrained culture of bias and corruption. The Department of Transportation announced a comprehensive overhaul of its training programs, focusing on anti-discrimination policies, transparency, and accountability. Several senior officials were forced to resign, and new leadership was brought in to rebuild trust with the public. Airports across the country implemented reforms inspired by the investigation, including anonymous reporting systems for passengers and staff to report misconduct. Eli watched the news coverage with a mix of pride and disbelief. His ordeal had sparked a movement larger than he could have imagined. Personal growth. Sitting at his dining table one evening, Eli reflected on how far he'd come. The journey had been exhausting, but it had also given him a renewed sense of purpose. He thought of his mother, the strength she'd instilled in him, and her advice to use his voice to make a difference. He decided to channel his experiences into advocacy. Eli began working with organizations focused on combating systemic racism and promoting equitable treatment in air travel and beyond. His speeches at conferences and community events were raw and honest, resonating deeply with audiences. "I didn't set out to be an activist," he admitted during one event, "but sometimes life chooses you, and when it does, you have to rise to the challenge." The antagonist's consequences. Ian Brady's trial became a high-profile case, drawing widespread media attention. Evidence of his discriminatory practices and financial misconduct was undeniable. Former colleagues testified against him, detailing how he manipulated the system for personal gain and targeted passengers based on race and appearance. Brady was convicted on multiple counts, including obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit fraud. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison and barred from working in any security or law enforcement capacity for life. For Eli, the trial was a bittersweet experience. Seeing Brady held accountable was satisfying, but it also highlighted the systemic failures that allowed such behavior to thrive. He knew there were countless others like Brady who hadn't been caught yet. Healing and rebuilding. Eli's personal life also began to flourish in the aftermath. His relationship with Marcus deepened, evolving from a professional partnership into a close friendship. They often joked about how their shared experience had turned them into reluctant crusaders for justice, but they both recognized the importance of their work. One evening, Marcus surprised Eli with a gift, a framed photo of Eli speaking at the press conference with the words, "Your voice matters," engraved at the bottom. "For the record," Marcus said with a grin, "I always knew you'd make a great advocate." Eli laughed, but his voice softened as he replied, "I wouldn't have done it without you." Subplots resolved. Eli's career as a freelance photographer also took an unexpected turn. The attention from his story brought him new clients who admired his resilience and creativity. He landed a project documenting diverse communities across the country, showcasing their strength and stories through his lens. During one of his shoots, he met a young girl named Amara, who reminded him of himself at her age, curious, determined, and full of dreams. She asked him endless questions about his camera and his travels, and Eli saw a spark in her that gave him hope for the future. "Do you think I can be a photographer someday?" she asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Eli smiled. "You can. Be anything you want, Amara. Just remember, never let anyone dim your light." Reflection. Late one night, Eli sat on his balcony, looking out at the city lights. He thought about the fear and anger he'd felt when he was detained, how small and powerless he'd felt in that moment. But he also thought about the courage it took to speak up, the people who had rallied around him, and the change they'd brought about together. He pulled out his journal, a habit he'd picked up during the aftermath of the ordeal, and began to write. This journey wasn't just about standing up for myself. It was about standing up for everyone who's ever felt invisible, unheard, or dehumanized. I've learned that resilience isn't just about surviving. It's about thriving in spite of everything. And while the fight for justice is far from over, I'm proud to know that I've played a small part in paving the way for a better future. Hopeful. Ending months later, Eli found himself back at the airport, preparing for another flight. This time, the experience was vastly different. The staff was courteous and professional, and the atmosphere felt welcoming rather than oppressive. As he passed through security, a young officer approached him. "Mr. Davis, I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "What you did made a difference. We're working hard to make sure this place is better for everyone." Eli nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Thank you. That means more than you know." As he boarded the plane and settled into his seat, Eli felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The clouds outside the window seemed brighter, the horizon more inviting. This wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of something new, and as the plane ascended into the sky, Eli smiled, ready to embrace whatever came next. Because sometimes the greatest journeys are the ones that change not just where we are, but who we are.